Ghost towns in the lucky country. The truth about Australia's abandoned cities. Picture modern Australia. Sydney is booming with over 5 million people. Melbourne is growing past 5 million. Brisbane is literally exploding with development that seems unstoppable. The property markets are red hot, construction cranes dominate the skylines, and migration continues to pour into these coastal metropolises. But while the coastal cities keep getting fuller and fuller, there's another reality that almost nobody talks about. Hundreds of kilometres inland, far from the glittering skylines and billion-dollar developments, entire communities are dying a slow and painful death. Schools are closing their doors for the last time. Hospitals are being abandoned by governments, and the few remaining residents are fighting against a development that seems completely unstoppable. Is this the price of progress? Is Australia paying the ultimate price for its coastal boom at the expense of its heartland? Or have these places made the mistakes themselves that make them uninhabitable today? The answer is more complicated than you think. In an era where 85% of all Australians live in coastal cities and the interior is being systematically depopulated at an alarming rate, we have to ask ourselves a fundamental question. Is Australia losing its soul? Is the country abandoning the very places that built its wealth and identity? Today, we analyse, without sugarcoating, 10 Australian towns that nobody is moving to anymore. We talk about economic collapse, about political failure, and about the question of whether these places still have a future or whether they are destined to become ghost towns. Welcome to an honest assessment. We've read your comments. Many of you wanted to hear the truth about regional Australia. Today, you're getting it. If you appreciate documentaries that put facts over nostalgia, then subscribe now and activate the bell. A like supports our independent research. Let's begin. Coober Pedy. When the opals run out, the town dies. To understand why people are leaving these towns, we need to start with one of the most extreme examples. Coober Pedy in South Australia. This town was once the opal capital of the world, producing over 90% of the world's precious opals. In the 1960s, thousands flocked here from across the globe, lured by the promise of quick wealth and the chance to strike it rich. The heat was so extreme, regularly exceeding 45 degrees Celsius in summer, that people lived underground in so-called dugouts carved into the hillsides. This wasn't poverty. This was pure adaptation to one of the harshest environments on Earth. But today, Coober Pedy tells a completely different story. The opal deposits are largely exhausted after decades of intensive mining. The population has dropped dramatically from over 3,500 in the 80s to barely 1,600 today. Almost half has disappeared in just 4 decades. Why isn't anyone moving here anymore? The answer is brutally simple and economically devastating. When the resource is gone, the town is gone. Coober Pedy never had economic diversification, no industry beyond opals, no agriculture possible in the desert, no tourism on a large scale, despite the unique underground lifestyle. We have to be honest here. The town planning failed completely. Nobody developed a plan B for when the mines would inevitably run dry. When the mines became unprofitable and closed one by one, there was nothing to keep people here. Today, the remaining residents struggle with crumbling infrastructure that nobody wants to repair, rising cost of living as economies of scale disappear, and the brutal fact that the nearest major city, Adelaide, is 650 kilometres away across some of Australia's most inhospitable terrain. Young people leave the town as soon as they can find work elsewhere. Schools have only a handful of students left. The hospital is critically understaffed. Coober Pedy is the perfect example of a single resource town that has no future left and serves as a warning to others. Leigh Creek. Coal, power plants, and collapse. From the desert we go north, also in South Australia. Leigh Creek was a model for planned mining towns. built in the 50s to supply coal for the Port Augusta power station. The town had everything: schools, sports centres, a swimming pool, a cinema. Over 2,000 people lived here. But Leigh Creek made the same mistake as Coober Pedy. There was only one employer, only one industry. When the power station closed in 2016, the death sentence for the town was sealed. Within 2 years, Leigh Creek was systematically evacuated. The South Australian government bought all the houses and paid out the residents. Today, the town is a ghost town. Empty, abandoned, a monument to lack of foresight. You can't completely criticise the government here. They offered people compensation. But the question remains, why was no plan for the post-coal era ever developed? For decades, alternative industries could have been established. The town could have been diversified. Instead, they simply gave up on it. This is the harsh reality of many Australian mining towns. When the mine closes, the town dies, and nobody seems to want to change that. Wittenoom, Australia's most toxic town. Some towns die because the economy collapses. Others die because they are literally deadly to human life. Wittenoom in Western Australia is the most toxic town in the country. Between 1937 and 1966, asbestos was mined here in massive quantities. Blue asbestos, the deadliest form. Thousands of tons of it were extracted and processed. The workers had absolutely no protective equipment. Families lived in houses whose walls were made of asbestos. Children played on piles of asbestos dust. The health consequences were catastrophic. Over 2,000 people have died from asbestos-related diseases. Mesothelioma, lung cancer, asbestosis. The dark figure is probably even higher. The Western Australian government declared the town officially uninhabitable. They erased Wittenoom from all official maps. The electricity was shut off. The roads were no longer maintained. But here comes the bizarre part. People still live there. As of today, there are fewer than 10, but they refuse to leave. They ignore the warnings, the health risks, the fact that their town officially no longer exists. Why? Some out of stubbornness, others out of nostalgia, some simply because they have nowhere else to go. Wittenoom is an extreme example of how industrial greed and government failure can destroy a town. The government knew early about the dangers. Documents prove this, but the mine continued to operate because it was profitable. This isn't conspiracy theory, this is documented history. Today, Wittenoom is a warning. Nobody moves here because every breath is potentially deadly. Port Pirie, lead poisoning in the industrial heart. Not far from Adelaide lies Port Pirie. At first glance, a completely normal industrial town. Over 14,000 inhabitants, one of the largest lead smelters in the world. But behind this facade hides a massive health problem. Port Pirie has the highest lead levels in children's blood in all of Australia. Studies show that over 1/3 of children under 5 years old have dangerously high lead levels. Lead damages neurological development, lowers IQ, leads to behavioural disorders. The source is clear. The smelter has been emitting lead particles for decades that settle in soils, homes, and on playgrounds. The government knows this. There are programs for blood testing, remediation initiatives, education campaigns. But the smelter continues to operate. It is the largest employer in the town. If you close it, the local economy collapses. This is the dilemma. The people in Port Pirie are trapped between economic dependence and health danger. Young families leave the town as soon as they learn the truth about the lead levels. Real estate prices are stagnating. Nobody wants to voluntarily move to a town where their own children are being poisoned. We need to take a clear position here. The operators of the smelter have failed for decades to reduce emissions to a safe level. The government has failed to enforce stricter regulations, and the victims are the children who grow up there. Port Pirie is an example of how industrial towns die because nobody wants to take the risk anymore. Broken Hill, the silver city that lost its shine. In the far west of New South Wales lies Broken Hill, once one of the richest cities in Australia. The silver, lead, and zinc mines made millionaires. The town had over 30,000 residents in its heyday. Today, there are barely 17,000. Almost half has disappeared. Broken Hill is struggling with multiple problems. The mines are largely exhausted. The remaining operations employ only fractions of the former workforce. The geographical isolation is extreme. The nearest major city, Adelaide, is over 450 kilometres away. Sydney is over 1,100 kilometres to the east. This isolation means everything is more expensive. Food, fuel, medical care. The cost of living is high, wages are not. For young people, there are hardly any prospects. The few jobs focus on mining, healthcare, and public service. Creative professions, IT, modern services, barely exist. Anyone who wants to study has to leave the town and rarely comes back. But we must also acknowledge the efforts. Broken Hill is trying to reinvent itself as a centre for art and tourism. The living desert sculptures attract visitors. Film productions use the dramatic landscape. But is that enough? The numbers say no. The population continues to shrink. Schools are closing. The hospital is chronically underfunded. Broken Hill is an example of a town that is fighting but slowly losing the fight. Whyalla. Steel crisis and structural change. From one mining town to the next. Whyalla in South Australia was the industrial powerhouse of the region. The steelworks employed thousands. The town grew to over 33,000 residents. But then came the crisis. In 2017, steel operator Arium faced insolvency. Thousands of jobs were at stake. The government had to intervene. Today, the plant operates under new management, but the future remains uncertain. Global steel prices fluctuate. Competition from Asia is overwhelming. Whyalla has a fundamental problem. It is a single industry town in an industry that is structurally under pressure. The population is stagnating at around 22,000. Many moved away when the crisis came. They are not coming back. Why should they? Wages in Adelaide are better, quality of life higher, future prospects clearer. In Whyalla, you live with the constant fear that the plant will get into trouble again. Investors hesitate. New industries are not settling here. The infrastructure is aging. The town urgently needs economic diversification. Projects in renewable energy have been announced. A hydrogen project could bring jobs. But these are promises, not reality. Until these projects are implemented, more years will pass. Whyalla shows how difficult it is to transform an industrial town when the main industry collapses. Ceduna. At the edge of the world, at the edge of hope. On the west coast of South Australia lies Ceduna, a small town with barely 3,000 residents. Geographically at the end of the Eyre Peninsula, economically at the end of the line. Ceduna is struggling with extreme social problems. The unemployment rate is well above the national average. Alcohol abuse, domestic violence, and drug problems shape everyday life. A large part of the population is of Indigenous origin, and the structural disadvantages are massive. We need to be very careful here not to fall into stereotypes. The problems in Ceduna are not due to the Indigenous population, but to decades of systematic neglect by politics and society. Lack of educational opportunities, lack of economic prospects, and historical injustice have created a toxic mix. In 2016, the government introduced the cashless debit card program. 80% of social benefits are transferred to a card that cannot be used to buy alcohol. The program is controversial. Supporters say it reduces alcohol abuse. Critics call it paternalistic and degrading. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. What is undisputed is this: Ceduna is bleeding out. Young people leave as soon as they can. Families move away if they have the means. What remains are the poorest, the oldest, and those who have nowhere else to go. The infrastructure is crumbling. The few businesses are struggling to survive. Ceduna needs massive investment in education, health, and economic development. But these investments are not coming. The town is too small, too far away, politically not important enough. That is the bitter reality. Mildura, water crisis and agricultural collapse. In the north of Victoria lies Mildura. Unlike the previous towns, Mildura is relatively large. Over 50,000 residents, it is a regional centre for agriculture, viticulture, citrus fruits, vegetables. But Mildura faces an existential threat. Water. The Murray-Darling, Australia's most important river system, is drying up. Years of drought, mismanagement, and over-extraction have brought the system to the brink of collapse. For Mildura, this means economic catastrophe. Agriculture depends completely on irrigation water. Without water, there is no harvest. Without harvest, there are no jobs. Without jobs, people leave the town. Population numbers are already stagnating. Young farmers are giving up and moving to the cities. The government has invested billions in the Murray-Darling plan. But the results are disappointing. Corruption, fraud, and political interference have undermined the system. Large agricultural operations continue to illegally take water while small farmers are left to die of thirst. Mildura is the victim of this policy. We need to criticise the federal government and state governments here. They have failed to consistently enforce water management. They have given in to political pressure and ignored scientific recommendations. Mildura could be a thriving town. The location is good. The infrastructure is in place. The potential is enormous. But without water, there is no future. And at the moment, it does not look like the problem can be solved. Kalgoorlie Boulder. Gold, pits, and dangers. Deep in the interior of Western Australia lies Kalgoorlie Boulder, the gold town. Gold has been mined here since the 1890s. The Super Pit mine is one of the largest open pit mines in the world. Over 30,000 people live here. At first glance, everything is going well. But the reality is more complex. Kalgoorlie has an image problem. It is known for rough living, alcohol excesses, and high crime rates. The town has one of the highest rates of domestic violence in Australia. Living conditions are harsh. Extreme heat in summer, dust, isolation. The nearest major city, Perth, is over 590 kilometres away. The cost of living is high. Real estate is expensive because supply is limited. Food costs more than in coastal cities. But the biggest challenge is the future of the mine. Gold is finite. Eventually, the super pit will be exhausted. What happens then? Kalgoorlie is making the same mistake as Coober Pedy and Leigh Creek. There is no serious diversification, no alternative industries, no plan B. The town lives on gold and will die with the gold if action is not taken soon. The Western Australian government needs to invest here. In education, in alternative economic sectors, in infrastructure that can support the town even after mining ends. But is that happening? No. They rely on the gold lasting for decades. This is short-sighted thinking that will cost the town dearly. Mount Isa. Heat, mines, and hopelessness. Our last stop is Mount Isa in Queensland, one of the hottest and most isolated cities in Australia. Over 1,800 kilometres from Brisbane, 1,900 kilometres from Darwin. The town lives off copper and lead mining. Over 18,000 people live here. But Mount Isa is struggling with massive problems. The mines have severely damaged the environment. Air pollution from sulfur dioxide is a constant issue. Health studies show elevated rates of respiratory diseases in children. The government has set limits, but they are regularly exceeded. This leads to an exodus of young families. Nobody wants to raise their children in an environment where the air is toxic. In addition, there is the extreme heat. Temperatures over 40 degrees are normal in summer. Living conditions are brutal. Social infrastructure is underdeveloped. There are hardly any recreational opportunities. Cultural offerings are almost completely absent. For young people, Mount Isa is a place you leave as soon as you can. Turnover is enormous. People come for the high wages in mining, work for a few years, and then move on. A stable community does not develop this way. Long-term residents are often older people who have spent their entire lives here and can no longer or do not want to move away. Mount Isa needs a radical transformation, stricter environmental regulations for the mines, investment in quality of life, diversification of the economy. But all this costs money, and the willingness to invest this money is not there. Instead, the town will slowly bleed out until the mines become unprofitable. Then, it will probably suffer the same fate as Leigh Creek. The common truth: Australia's forgotten interior. What connects all these towns? They are all victims of the same development. Australia is concentrating more on the coasts. 85% of the population lives in coastal cities, and that percentage continues to grow every year. The interior is being systematically neglected by successive governments. Politics invests where the votes are, and they are on the coast. Regional towns get the leftovers, the scraps, the promises never fulfilled. We need to be honest here. Many of these towns have made serious mistakes. They relied far too much on a single resource. They did not pursue economic diversification when times were good. They destroyed the environment without thinking about long-term consequences. But they are also victims of systematic political failure at state and federal levels. For decades, they were ruthlessly exploited for their resources, but the massive profits flowed to the cities and international shareholders. Infrastructure was not renewed when it needed to be. Education and health were chronically neglected and underfunded. Young people had no prospects and no choice but to leave. This is a vicious circle that can only be broken through massive state intervention and genuine political will. But this intervention is not coming. Instead, these towns are dying a slow and agonizing death. Schools are closing their doors. Hospitals are being scaled down to skeleton staff. Businesses are shutting down permanently. The remaining residents are fighting desperately, but often in vain, against the inevitable. Is this the future we want for Australia? A country where everyone lives crowded on the coast and the interior becomes an empty desert? Or is there still a chance to reverse this development? In summary, these 10 towns show the true face of regional decline in Australia. Coober Pedy is dying slowly because the Opals are exhausted. Leigh Creek was systematically abandoned because coal is no longer needed. Wittenoom is poisoned by deadly asbestos. Port Pirie is poisoning its own children with lead. Broken Hill is irreversibly losing its shine. Whyalla is desperately fighting a dying steel industry. Ceduna is suffocating from massive social problems. Mildura is literally dying of thirst without water. Kalgoorlie Boulder is living on borrowed time. Mount Isa is polluting its own air. This is not a future. This is failure on all levels, economically, politically, and socially. Australia must decide whether it wants to save its interior or whether it is prepared to let it die. The answer to this question will determine the future of the country. But what do you think? Is the decline of these towns really inevitable, or the result of political failures? Should the state invest massively in regional areas, even if it is not economically profitable? Or is it more realistic to systematically abandon these towns and relocate the people? Write your opinion in the comments. We value factual discussion. Do not forget to rate the video and subscribe so you do not miss any honest analyses about Australia. Thank you for watching. Stay informed.